Hey guys, tonight we begin with the dark, fascinating and disturbing world of ancient Rome. While Rome gave us roads, aqueducts and legal systems, they also left us with some of the most absurd, theatrical and bone-chilling punishments the ancient world ever knew. What you're about to hear defies our modern notions of justice and humanity. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Imagine for a moment walking down the cobblestone streets of ancient Rome, under the shadow of the Colosseum, where justice wasn't swift or merciful, but meticulously designed to create maximum suffering and public spectacle. In ancient Rome, your crime determined not just if you would die, but how. And believe me, the Romans elevated punishment to a level of macabre artistry. While today we consider prison as the standard punishment, Romans saw pain, humiliation, and symbolism as essential elements of justice. If you were convicted in Rome, you might face being sewn inside a sack with live animals, buried up to your neck with hot ashes poured down your throat, or even crucified upside down for an even slower, more agonizing death than standard crucifixion. Most shocking isn't just the brutality of these punishments, but the meticulous thought behind each one. Romans believed punishment should mirror the crime, not just in severity but in symbolism. A traitor didn't simply die, he was erased from history, his statue smashed, his name chiseled off monuments. The very air of Rome smelled of incense from temples, fresh bread from bakeries, and occasionally the unmistakable aroma of burning flesh and fear. Because in Rome, justice wasn't blind. It was a public spectacle designed to terrify and entertain in equal measure. Tonight, we'll explore the most bizarre punishments of ancient Rome, from Vestal virgins buried alive to people thrown from the Tarpeian Rock. Let's settle in for a journey through the darker side of one of history's most influential civilizations. To understand Roman punishment, we must first grasp how Romans viewed justice itself. For them, justice wasn't abstract or philosophical. It was tangible, visible, and often soaked in blood. The Latin word for punishment, poena, gives us our modern term, pain. This is no coincidence. Romans believed punishment should hurt, should mark, should transform. The Roman legal system was surprisingly sophisticated for its time. They had courts, lawyers, judges, and intricate laws, covering everything from property disputes to murder. But what set Roman justice apart was its theatrical nature. Punishment wasn't just about dealing with criminals. It was about creating cautionary tales that would echo through the forum and beyond. Status mattered enormously in determining punishment. A wealthy patrician might be allowed a dignified suicide for the same crime that would send a plebeian to a brutal public execution. Slaves had virtually no legal protection at all. They could be tortured merely to extract testimony against their masters, whether they had witnessed anything or not. Roman punishment evolved dramatically over the centuries. During the Republic, punishments were relatively measured. Exile was common for the upper classes, while lower classes might face flogging or hard labor. But as the Republic gave way to the Empire, as the population swelled and unrest simmered, punishments became increasingly spectacular and grim. Emperors discovered that public executions served multiple purposes. They eliminated troublemakers, yes, but they also provided entertainment for restless masses and demonstrated imperial power in the most visceral way possible. Death became performance art under emperors like Nero and Caligula, who sometimes personally supervised executions or added creative flourishes to standard punishments. Central to Roman justice was the concept of deterrence through terror. They believed the fear of punishment would maintain social order far better than actual punishment itself. And so punishments were designed to be not just painful, but memorable, not just deadly, but haunting. The most effective punishment, Romans believed, was one that lingered in the mind long after the criminal's body had been disposed of. This philosophy led to some of the most ingenious forms of cruelty ever devised by civilized people, each calibrated to maximize both suffering and spectacle. As we drift deeper into the world of Roman justice, remember that these weren't the actions of mindless barbarians, but of a highly sophisticated civilization that gave us engineering marvels, literature, and legal principles we still use today. The same minds that conceived the Pantheon also conceived these punishments. That's what makes them truly chilling. In ancient Rome, the Vestal Virgins were the spiritual equivalent of a national power grid. If they failed, everything malfunctioned. These women were carefully selected before puberty to serve the goddess Vesta, guardian of the eternal flame. Their job was to keep that sacred fire burning and, most importantly, to keep themselves away from men for 30 years. Breaking a vow of chastity in ancient Rome wasn't just frowned upon. It was treated as though you detonated a nuclear bomb in the middle of the Senate. If a Vestal was caught having relations, the punishment was literally to be buried alive. Yes, alive. Not metaphorically cancelled, not sent to a timeout corner, straight up entombed underground. Why buried and not, say, executed with a sword like a normal Roman crime? Simple. Romans believed you couldn't spill a Vestal's blood. It would offend the gods, so they found an ingenious workaround. They would dig a small chamber, lower her down with a flickering oil lamp, a bit of bread, and a jug of water. Because, hey, hydration matters, and then seal her inside. Voila! No blood, no mess, no divine tantrums. The poor girl would lie there in darkness, contemplating her life choices, while Rome dusted off its hands and moved on. You might think the men she was caught with would suffer the same fate, but no, they were generally just flogged to death in public. Still brutal, but quicker. To be fair, becoming a Vestal was a great honor. You got front row seats at the games, rode in fancy carriages, and even had the power to pardon condemned prisoners with a single word. But it all came with one small condition. Mess up once, and you'll be sleeping underground permanently. And yes, Rome took it that seriously. One famous Vestal, Cornelia, was accused during Emperor Domitian's reign. Before being sentenced, she reportedly cried out, "Does Caesar think I've had relations with a god then? For no mortal man has touched me." Bold move. Didn't work. The most disturbing aspect of this punishment was its slowness. It wasn't a quick death like decapitation or crucifixion. It was a sentence to die slowly from starvation, thirst, or suffocation, alone in darkness, with just enough time to contemplate your transgression. Historians believe some victims may have survived for several days before succumbing. The last known execution of a Vestal occurred as late as the 4th century CE, just before Christianity became the empire's dominant religion. For nearly 1,000 years, this practice endured, a testament to the power of Roman tradition and the fear of divine wrath. The physical process of burying a Vestal alive was conducted with disturbing ceremonial precision. On the day of execution, the condemned Vestal was stripped of her sacred regalia, dressed in funeral garments, and placed in a covered litter so that no one could see or hear her. The Romans believed that seeing a Vestal on her way to execution would bring terrible luck. The procession moved in complete silence through the streets of Rome to the Campus Sceleratus, or Evil Field, located just inside the city walls. There, a small underground chamber had been prepared with a bed, a lamp, a small table with minimal food and water. These weren't acts of mercy. They merely extended the suffering while allowing Romans to claim they hadn't directly killed her. The Pontifex Maximus, Rome's chief priest, would perform final rites before the Vestal descended into the chamber. Some accounts suggest he would turn away as she entered, unwilling to watch directly. Once inside, workers would quickly fill the entrance with earth and stones until no trace of the chamber remained visible from the surface. What makes this punishment particularly horrifying is the psychological torture. The Vestal knew exactly what was happening. She understood she would die slowly in darkness, alone with her thoughts. The lamp would eventually sputter out, the food and water would run out, and all the while, life in Rome continued above her head. The political dimensions of Vestal executions cannot be overlooked. Historians note that accusations of unchastity against Vestals often coincided with political upheaval or natural disasters. When Rome needed a scapegoat, a Vestal might be accused, tried, and buried with remarkable speed. The gods were angry, Romans would reason, and someone had to pay. Emperor Domitian was particularly known for executing Vestals. He buried 3 during his reign, possibly to demonstrate his religious authority or distract from political problems. The last of these was Cornelia, mentioned earlier, whose protestations of innocence were ignored despite her decades of faithful service. Archaeological evidence suggests that not every condemned Vestal actually died in her underground chamber. Recent findings indicate that some chambers had hidden exits, suggesting that occasionally a condemned Vestal might be secretly released after public opinion had moved on to other matters. These were likely rare exceptions, however, not the rule. So next time you feel overwhelmed by your job, just remember, at least your boss isn't threatening to bury you in a hole with stale bread and a dusty oil lamp. Rome, where HR policies were written in stone and fear. Our ancient Rome, cradle of philosophy, architecture and punishments that sound like feverish nightmares. Let's talk about the Poena Kuli, which translates as punishment of the sack. And no, this isn't some weird medieval sack race. It's what happened if you committed the Roman taboo par excellence, killing your father. Romans didn't just fine you or throw you in jail. No. If you murdered your dear old dad, they gave you the deluxe punishment package, starring you and 4 unfortunate animals. First, the Romans would bind your hands, perhaps give you a moment to reflect on your life choices. Spoiler, you'd made bad choices. Then they'd sew you inside a large leather sack. Sounds cozy, right? But it gets better. Joining you in the sack would be a dog for the loyalty you lacked. A monkey, because why not add chaos, a serpent to slither through your remorse, and a rooster perhaps to announce your doom at daybreak. Then the sack, now teeming with bad decisions and animal rage, was thrown into a river, ideally a deep one. The result? A churning, howling, screeching, hissing blender of panic and poetic justice. Nobody really knows why these specific animals were chosen, but historians believe it was symbolic. The dog represented family, the monkey chaos, the serpent deceit, and the rooster vigilance. Basically, your sins made flesh and feathers. Can you imagine the moment inside that sack? You're being beaten on the head by a monkey while a serpent coils around your leg. The dog is losing its mind, and the rooster thinks it's Tuesday. If this sounds like the worst escape room ever created, you're not far off. The punishment was rare, thankfully, but Rome would revive it occasionally, just to make their point, usually under emperors who loved theatrics. It wasn't just about killing the criminal, it was about making a statement and maybe traumatizing a few spectators while they were at it. Think about the twisted psychology here. You weren't just doomed to die, but to do so in the company of chaos, betrayal, and violence, physically represented by creatures you couldn't control. It was a death without dignity, without ceremony, just panic and confusion. The Poena Kuli also highlighted the importance of fatherhood in Roman society. Patricide wasn't just murder, it was the violation of natural order, a crime against the gods themselves. By destroying your father, you destroyed the chain of authority that held Rome together, from the emperor down to the humblest household. The historical record of Poena Kuli executions is sparse but noteworthy. The earliest recorded instance dates back to 100 BCE, and the practice continued, with varying frequency, well into the imperial period. Emperor Claudius was known to have revived it after it had fallen into disuse, perhaps to emphasize his commitment to traditional Roman values. The preparation of the sack itself required significant effort. It was typically made from oxhide, carefully sewn with strong cords to ensure no easy escape. The animals weren't randomly selected from the streets either. They were specifically chosen for their aggression or symbolic significance, and sometimes even deliberately antagonized before being placed in the sack to ensure maximum chaos. The public nature of the punishment was essential to its purpose. The condemned would be paraded through the streets, their crimes proclaimed by heralds before the final sewing into the sack occurred at the riverbank or seashore. Crowds would gather to witness this spectacle, and records suggest that betting often occurred on how long it would take the sack to sink. What's particularly disturbing is the care taken to ensure the victim remained conscious and aware throughout the initial proceedings. Unlike other Roman executions where a quick death might mercifully occur, the poena culae was designed to maximize terror and awareness. The victim would be fully cognizant when the animals were introduced into the sack, experiencing the full psychological horror of what was happening. The religious dimensions of this punishment were significant. Before the execution, the condemned would be given a special cap to wear, similar to the one worn by sacrificial victims, marking them as an offering to appease the gods. Prayers and sacrifices might be made to purify the community of the taint of patricide. Some legal texts indicate that variations existed. In regions where a suitable river wasn't available, the condemned might instead be thrown to wild beasts in the arena. In other cases, especially during later periods, the victim might be burned alive instead. The common thread was the addition of animals, symbolism, and public spectacle. The punishment continued in some form until the Christian Byzantine Empire, though it became increasingly symbolic rather than literal. Eventually, the horrific physical reality of sewing criminals into sacks with animals gave way to simpler drowning or burning, though the legal terminology remained the same. So, next time your father makes a bad joke or forgets your birthday, just be thankful you weren't born in Rome. Back then, patricide didn't mean therapy, it meant time with the snake circus in a sack. When we hear the word crucifixion, most of us think of one thing: a wooden cross, a slow, agonizing death, and a warning to anyone watching not to mess with the state. It was Rome's signature punishment, brutal, public, and humiliating. But let the Romans occasionally add a little creative twist. Enter inverted crucifixion, yes, upside down, because apparently dying upright wasn't humiliating enough. This method was reserved for special cases, usually people the authorities really wanted to make an example of: criminals, traitors, and occasionally rebels who insisted on being difficult even in death. But perhaps the most famous inverted crucifixion was that of St. Peter, one of Jesus' 12 apostles. According to tradition, when Peter was sentenced to die by crucifixion under Emperor Nero, he made an odd request: "Crucify me upside down. I am not worthy to die as my Lord did." And Rome, being the efficiency machine that it was, said, "Sure, why not?" Now here's where things get a bit intense. Crucifixion was already one of the worst ways to die, combining suffocation, blood loss, and total public humiliation. But flipping the body changed the dynamics. Blood rushed to the head, muscles strained in unnatural ways, breathing became almost impossible, and it hurt a lot. Think of it this way: it's the difference between sitting through a boring lecture and sitting through that lecture upside down while someone hammers nails through your ankles. Not exactly the same vibe. But this wasn't just about suffering. It was about symbolism. An inverted cross became, ironically, a symbol of humility. Peter's choice was meant to show reverence, not rebellion. Unfortunately, that image was later appropriated by horror movies and metal bands, giving it a very different PR spin. Romans didn't care about the symbolism. For them, it was about sending a message: cross us, and we'll make your death as weird and memorable as possible. Inverted crucifixion was especially degrading because it exposed the condemned person's private parts, adding sexual humiliation to physical torture. What makes this punishment particularly disturbing is that it required almost the same amount of effort as regular crucifixion, but with the sole purpose of increasing suffering and shame. It was cruelty by design, not by necessity. There are reports that some victims of inverted crucifixion died faster due to blood pooling in the brain, a small mercy given the circumstances. But for the Romans, speed wasn't the point. The spectacle was. When you think of a motivational speech, you might imagine a coach shouting, "We win together, we lose together." But in ancient Rome, the phrase could easily have been, "We march together, or 1 in 10 of you dies." Welcome to the charming world of decimation. A military punishment so brutal it makes modern boot camp look like a spa day. Here's how it worked. If a Roman unit showed cowardice in battle, attempted to desert, or mutinied, the commander had a nuclear option. Not in the explosive sense, more in the psychological warfare sense. The entire group would be lined up, and every 10th soldier would draw lots. The lucky winner? He would be beaten to death by his 9 comrades with clubs, stones, or whatever was handy. Yes, you heard that right. You didn't just face death, you had to kill your buddy, the guy you probably shared wine and bread with the night before, all to prove loyalty to Rome. It was like Survivor Roman Legion edition, except nobody won immunity and everyone got traumatized. And don't assume they had a break afterward. The 9 survivors didn't get congratulations and a long weekend. No, they were given barley instead of wheat for rations. A Roman way of saying, "We're disappointed in you," and forced to camp outside the safety of the fort. The logic behind decimation was cold, but effective. If you feared your own comrades more than the enemy, you'd think twice before running away. And curiously enough, it worked. Roman discipline was legendary, and decimation kept soldiers marching in line, even if they had to step over a few bodies to do it. One of the most infamous uses of decimation was by Crassus, the wealthy general who formed a triumvirate with Julius Caesar and Pompey. After a humiliating defeat in Spartacus's slave revolt, he decimated an unfortunate unit. Because nothing says we're back on track like a casual internal massacre, the truly awful aspect of decimation was its randomness. It didn't matter if you were the bravest soldier in the unit or a known coward. You had the same odds of drawing the short straw. It was a death lottery, and everybody played. The few sources that describe actual decimations paint scenes of absolute horror. Friends forced to beat friends to death, brothers clubbing brothers, all while officers watched with approval. The psychological trauma for the survivors must have been incalculable. The origin of decimation stretches back to the early Republic, with the first recorded instance occurring around 471 BCE under the consul Appius Claudius. When his troops refused to attack the enemy due to perceived poor leadership, Claudius responded by decimating the units. The message was clear. Fear your commanders more than your enemies. The actual implementation of decimation was conducted with chilling efficiency. The tribune would gather the condemned unit and divide them into groups of 10. Each group would draw lots, often using marked pieces of wood. The soldier who drew the marked lot was then taken a few paces away, while his 9 comrades collected their clubs. What's particularly disturbing is that refusal to participate in the beating wasn't an option. Any soldier who showed reluctance would himself be executed, creating a macabre situation where men had to kill their friends to save themselves. This wasn't just punishment, it was forced complicity in brutality. After the executions, the remaining soldiers were forced to sleep outside the protective walls of the camp, vulnerable to enemy attacks. Their rations were downgraded from wheat to barley, a less desirable grain usually fed to animals. These measures ensured that the punishment extended beyond just the executed 10th, affecting the entire unit for weeks or months. Historical records suggest that decimation wasn't a common punishment. It was reserved for extreme cases of cowardice or mutiny. Its rarity actually enhanced its effectiveness. The mere threat of decimation was often enough to maintain discipline in difficult circumstances. Marcus Licinius Crassus's use of decimation during the Third Servile War, the famous slave uprising led by Spartacus, is perhaps the most well-documented case. After his legate Mummius suffered a defeat because his men fled the battlefield, Crassus decimated the units involved, approximately 500 men, executed by their own comrades. The remaining forces subsequently fought with desperate courage, perhaps more afraid of their general than the enemy. Julius Caesar, interestingly, rarely used decimation, despite his military campaigns. He preferred to inspire loyalty through shared hardship and rewards rather than extreme punishment. This suggests that even in Rome, opinions differed on the effectiveness of such brutal discipline. Decimation gradually fell out of favor during the empire, though it was occasionally revived by particularly strict or desperate commanders. The Emperor Macrinus attempted to revive the practice in the 3rd century CE, but by then, the composition of the army had changed so dramatically that such brutal discipline risked total mutiny rather than compliance. Say you lived in ancient Rome, or more precisely, the late Roman Empire during those twilight centuries, when things got weirder, darker, and much more obsessed with heresy. You spoke out against the church or challenged some sacred belief. Rome didn't just scold you. They gifted you an accessory you'd never forget, the heretic's fork. Picture this, a metal bar with 2 prongs at each end. One end pointed upward under your chin, the other drove straight into your upper chest. A little fork making a sandwich of your neck. Sounds uncomfortable. Oh, we're just getting started. Once this lovely device was attached, you were forbidden from moving your head at all. Look down, stabbed. Look up, stabbed. Try to whisper a heretical thought to the guy next to you, stabbed by your own collar. It didn't draw blood, at least not at first. That was the genius of it. The fork wasn't meant to kill you. It was meant to exhaust you mentally, physically, and spiritually. They'd leave you standing, sometimes for days, tensing every muscle just to avoid impaling yourself. It was like playing Don't Move, where the prize was not slowly skewering your own throat. And although we call it the heretic's fork, it was also used on blasphemers, witches, suspected liars, and anyone who annoyed a bishop before breakfast. It was a versatile torture, tailored for silence, stillness, and soul-crushing discomfort. To make things even more theatrical, the fork sometimes had little Latin inscriptions etched into it. Things like, "I renounce my sin," or "I am guilty," because nothing prompts your confession like being slowly impaled by typography. What's wild is that this punishment wasn't even one of Rome's most extreme. It was more like a starter package for sinners. No blood, no public execution, just quiet suffering and internal panic. A kind of introductory course in agony, Heresy 101. Guards would watch you constantly, looking for any movement or sign of collapse. When you finally fell, and everyone eventually did, this was often taken as a sign of guilt. After all, wouldn't an innocent person stand firm? The torture didn't end there. Once the fork was removed, you might face additional interrogation, now with neck muscles so tight and painful that nodding to confess anything seemed like the only relief. As the empire Christianized, the fork evolved to be used more selectively against enemies of the faith, with theological justification added to what was essentially a simple but brutally effective method for breaking spirits. Forget passive-aggressive texts or dramatic social media unfollowing. In ancient Rome, if you betrayed the state, they didn't just cut you off, they threw you off a cliff. Welcome to the Tarpeian Rock, a steep 80-foot drop on the southern face of the Capitoline Hill, a short walk from the Roman Forum. It wasn't just a scenic overlook, it was where the Republic took out the trash by hurling traitors straight off it, and yes, it was as theatrical as it sounds. Now the rock got its name from Tarpeia, a young Roman woman who betrayed the city to the invading Sabines in exchange for what she thought would be shiny gold bracelets. The Sabines, always literal thinkers, crushed her with their shields instead, technically fulfilling the deal. Her body was thrown from the cliff and the rock was named in her honor. Moral of the story: don't trust invaders or vague payment plans. But after that, the Tarpeian rock became Rome's favorite tool for dealing with traitors, corrupt officials, false witnesses, and anyone who made the state say, "Yeah, this one needs a dramatic punishment." No hanging, no sword, just a short flight and a sudden stop. The condemned were often stripped naked, displayed in procession, and then marched to the edge where gravity took care of the sentencing. And yes, there was usually a crowd. Nothing like a good old-fashioned execution to liven up market day. It was public, it was final, and it was symbolic. You weren't just dying, you were being removed from the physical city and spiritually, the ultimate cancellation, Rome edition. Interestingly, the rock was within stone-throwing distance of the Temple of Jupiter, which meant if you lied to the gods or the state, your final moments included a prime view of the heavens, briefly. Over time, more elaborate punishments came along. Lions, crucifixions, burning tunics. But the Tarpeian rock remained a classic, elegant in its simplicity, brutal in its message. The psychological beauty of this punishment was in its visibility. Roman citizens could stand at a safe distance and see exactly what happened to traitors. They could hear the screams, see the fall, witness the impact. There was no room for uncertainty or rumor. The message was clear: betray Rome and you'll become a spectacle. The Tarpeian rock wasn't just any cliff. Its geological features made it particularly suitable for executions. With a sheer drop onto jagged rocks below, the fall was almost certainly fatal, though not always instantly so. Some victims reportedly survived the initial impact, only to die slowly from their injuries while the crowd watched. This added an extra layer of horror to the punishment, the possibility of lingering in agony after the fall. The procession to the rock followed a specific route designed to maximize public exposure. Starting at the Forum, where the condemned might be given a final chance to speak, though few took it, the procession would wind through crowded streets. By the time it reached the Capitoline Hill, a substantial crowd would have gathered. This wasn't just execution, it was public theater with a message. Not all victims were common criminals. Several prominent Romans met their end at the Tarpeian rock. Spurius Cassius, a Roman consul, was executed there in 485 BCE for allegedly attempting to seize power. Marcus Manlius Capitolinus, once a hero who had saved Rome from the Gauls, was later thrown from the rock for sedition. The irony was striking. A hero who had defended the very hill from which he would later be thrown to his death. The legal process leading to execution at the Tarpeian rock was surprisingly formal. A proper trial was required, with evidence presented before the Senate for nobility or before magistrates for common citizens. While these trials weren't always fair by modern standards, they did provide a veneer of legal legitimacy to what was essentially state-sanctioned murder. What made this punishment particularly potent was its irrevocability. Unlike other sentences which might be commuted or pardoned at the last minute, a practice emperors sometimes used to demonstrate mercy, once you went over the edge of the Tarpeian rock, there was no turning back. Gravity doesn't negotiate. The visual impact of the location cannot be overstated. The Capitoline Hill was one of Rome's 7 hills and housed the Temple of Jupiter, the city's most important religious site. To be executed, there was to be rejected not just by Rome's people, but by its gods as well. It was spiritual and civic excommunication in one brutal act. The Tarpeian rock remained in use well into the imperial period, though gradually supplanted by more elaborate forms of execution. Even as Rome changed from republic to empire, the rock maintained its symbolic power. It represented Roman authority in its most elemental form, unyielding, deadly, and final. So the next time someone says they really threw them under the bus, remind them that the Romans did it first. No wheels, just stone and betrayal echoing across the hills. Welcome to the Colosseum. Stone, sweat, and 50,000 roaring fans. Ancient Rome's version of cable TV. Today's main event, damnatio ad bestias, or as we'd call it, being fed to wild beasts while everyone eats snacks. This punishment, meaning condemnation to the beasts, was Rome's go-to for criminals, traitors, prisoners of war, and most tragically Christians who wouldn't bow to the imperial gods. And make no mistake, this wasn't just about death. It was about spectacle. Rome didn't believe in boring executions. They believed in theatre. The condemned were thrown into an arena where hungry lions, leopards, bears, or sometimes even elephants were waiting. But here's the twist. Rome being Rome, they often dressed up the victims first. That's right. They turned their deaths into morality plays. One unfortunate might be dressed as Orpheus, only to be torn apart mid-lyre solo. Another might play a mythological villain like Prometheus, only to have birds peck at him in an accurate recreation. It was entertainment, justice, and religious propaganda, all wrapped up in one fur-covered mess. You might ask, did they even get a chance to defend themselves? Absolutely not. This wasn't a trial, it was a death sentence wrapped in applause. The crowd came to see blood. And if the lions were sleepy that day, no problem. The Romans had tricks like prodding them with hot irons or keeping them hungry for a couple of days beforehand. The show must go on. And remember, this wasn't limited to hardened criminals. You could end up in the arena for theft, political dissent, or even being on the wrong side of religious law. The only thing standing between you and Lunch Lion was the favor of a very generous emperor. But don't mistake this for mere sadism. It was calculated, a warning to anyone watching. Step out of line, and this could be you. Rome ruled by fear and felines. Over time, Christian martyrs turned the script around, turning bestial death into a badge of honor. But for most, damnatio ad bestias was less about glory and more about blood. The added cruelty was that many victims didn't die instantly. Unlike decapitation or even crucifixion, being attacked by animals could be prolonged, with the victim suffering multiple attacks as the crowd cheered each new assault. It wasn't uncommon for executioners to have to step in at the end to finish the job. The mechanics of damnatio ad bestias involved careful preparation. Animals weren't simply released into an arena with victims. They were kept in underground chambers beneath the Colosseum, in darkness and often without food for days to ensure maximum aggression. Specialized animal handlers, the bestiarii, trained specifically to manage these creatures for the arena, would guide them through a system of pulleys, cages, and trapdoors to create the most dramatic entrance possible. While lions and bears were common, exotic animals were prized for special executions. Records indicate that giraffes, rhinoceroses, hippopotamuses, and even crocodiles were sometimes used. Emperor Commodus reportedly had condemned men tied to stakes as he personally shot arrows at them from a safe distance, playing the role of Hercules hunting. This wasn't just punishment, it was imperial theater with the emperor as the star. The types of criminals condemned to the beasts followed a hierarchy. Common criminals might face swift destruction by a single lion. Enemies of the state, particularly those who challenged imperial authority, received more elaborate deaths, often involving multiple animals and theatrical scenarios mimicking mythological stories. Christian martyrs were frequently given the most public and prolonged deaths as warnings against religious defiance. What's particularly disturbing is that this all took place in a festive atmosphere. The Colosseum events began early in the morning and continued all day. Animal hunts and executions typically occurred in the morning, with gladiatorial combats following in the afternoon. Vendors sold food, drinks, and souvenirs. Betting was rampant, not just on gladiator matches, but on how long condemned criminals would survive. Emperor Nero took this spectacle to new extremes, using Christians as human torches during his garden parties while releasing wild animals among them. Tacitus, a Roman historian not particularly sympathetic to Christians, described these events as excessively cruel even by Roman standards. The smell in the arena during these events must have been overwhelming, a mixture of blood, animal musk, sweat, and fear. Spectators in the lower rows sometimes carried perfumed handkerchiefs to mask the worst of it, though this was considered somewhat effeminate. Real Romans, apparently, embraced the stench of death as part of the experience. Some victims were given weapons to defend themselves, not out of mercy, but to prolong the entertainment. These weren't proper weapons, but often wooden swords or dull spears, enough to create the illusion of a fighting chance without any real possibility of survival. The crowd particularly enjoyed these uneven contests, cheering when a condemned man landed a lucky blow before inevitably succumbing. The religious dimension of damnatio ad bestias can't be overlooked. Many executions were formally dedicated to gods like Saturn or Jupiter. Before the main events, sacrifices would be made to ensure divine approval. This religious framing helped Romans justify the brutality as not just entertainment, but a necessary part of maintaining cosmic order. The gods demanded blood, and Rome was happy to provide it. Perhaps most chilling were the hunts at lunch, or meridiani, scheduled during the midday break. While spectators ate their meals, criminals were thrown to animals one after another in quick succession, with little theatrical enhancement. These were essentially fast food executions, efficient, routine, and consumed along with bread and wine. The practice continued until Constantine III began to restrict it in the early 4th century as Christianity gained influence. However, animal hunts continued well into the 6th century, only without human victims. The Colosseum's blood-soaked sand would eventually be replaced by water for mock naval battles, but the memory of thousands torn apart for entertainment lingered in Roman consciousness. So, the next time you complain about jury duty, be thankful it doesn't involve dressing as a myth and dodging leopards. All right, in ancient Rome, getting a death sentence didn't always mean you were dragged to the arena or thrown off a cliff. Sometimes, if you were lucky, or rather politically connected, you received a special kind of punishment: forced suicide. Sounds contradictory, right? We're not going to kill you, but we strongly suggest you do it yourself. Here's how it worked. If you were a senator, a noble, or just someone high enough in Roman society to own more than one tunic, and you managed to offend the emperor, perhaps by plotting a coup, perhaps just by existing too confidently, you'd receive a quiet visit. You'd be handed a scroll, a polite message from the emperor, and it would say something like, "You have dishonored the state. Please take the honorable route out." Translation: kill yourself before sundown, or we'll do it for you and make it unpleasant. The upside, if you complied, your family kept your property. Your name might even remain unstained in the records. It was sort of the Roman version of a severance package, with blood instead of paperwork. This wasn't considered humiliation. It was seen as noble. In fact, many elites viewed it as a final act of control, a chance to write their own ending, sometimes literally. Think warm bath, a razor to the wrist, and a final monologue, very much in keeping with Rome's love of drama. The philosopher Seneca the Younger famously faced this fate. Accused of being part of a conspiracy against Nero, possibly falsely, he was told to end things himself. He cut his wrists, then his ankles, but the bleeding was slow, so he drank poison. That failed too. Finally, he entered a hot bath to speed things up. It was less a suicide and more a grim chemistry experiment. Forced suicide was essentially state-sanctioned dignity, a facade of choice that masked absolute power. Rome gave you the illusion of honor while ensuring you were quietly erased without a trial, without a crowd, just the hiss of hot water and the silence of complicity. This method had benefits for both sides. For the emperor, it avoided the potentially problematic spectacle of executing a popular citizen, which might stir sympathy or even riots. For the condemned, it offered a semblance of control over the uncontrollable. The preparations for an honorable suicide were almost ceremonial. The condemned would typically dine with close friends, distribute personal possessions, and perhaps dictate a final letter or will. Some even offered sacrifices to the gods or recited poetry. It was more a transition ritual than an execution. The preferred methods varied, but opening one's veins in a warm bath was particularly popular among Roman elites. The warm water accelerated bleeding and reduced pain. Alternatively, some chose poison, especially hemlock, which caused gradual paralysis and relatively painless death. Suffocation or starvation were less common, but did occur. What makes this punishment particularly fascinating is how it blends coercion with consideration. Rome was essentially telling you, you must die, but we respect you enough to let you choose how. It was brutality with kid gloves. Historians have documented numerous cases of this phenomenon, especially during the reigns of emperors like Nero, Tiberius, and Domitian. In one telling case, when General Corbulo received Nero's message urging him to suicide, he simply exclaimed, "Axios, I deserve it," and fell on his own sword, showing loyalty to the empire even in his final act. For families, forced suicide offered some macabre comfort. They could be present during the final moments, something denied to families of those publicly executed. Additionally, the family estate typically remained intact, without the confiscation that normally accompanied execution for treason. Interestingly, as Christianity began to spread through Rome, this practice became problematic, as the new religion classified suicide as sinful. This created a moral dilemma for Christians faced with this choice: sin by committing suicide or risk torture and public execution. Historians note that forced suicide was particularly common during periods of political transition or purge. When a new emperor took power, those closely associated with the previous regime often received the scroll and the implicit choice. It was Rome's way of political housecleaning, without the messy public trials that might reveal too much about how imperial politics actually worked. Some victims attempted to game the system. There are records of Romans who, upon receiving the death order, would pretend to comply but actually go into hiding, hoping the political winds would shift before they were discovered. Few succeeded in this gambit. Roman authorities were thorough in confirming deaths, often requiring witnesses or physical proof. The psychological impact on Roman society was significant. For the elite, the knowledge that disfavor could lead to that scroll arriving at any moment created an atmosphere of perpetual anxiety. Many maintained poison rings or concealed daggers as a constant preparation for the possibility that they might need to end their lives quickly and with dignity. So if you've ever thought your boss was passive-aggressive, imagine being formally invited to self-destruct by an imperial messenger. Rome didn't always kill you. Sometimes it just elegantly let you do it beautifully. If you've ever complained about an uncomfortable chair, ancient Rome would like to have a few words with you, because one of their most imaginative punishments involved furniture, the now infamous wooden horse, or as it should have been called, the straddle of pain. This device wasn't an actual horse, of course. It was a tall, narrow, sharply angled wooden beam, shaped like an A-frame, with an extremely thin ridge. The condemned, usually thieves, slaves, or rebellious soldiers, were forced to straddle it. That's right. All their body weight pressed down on that sharp edge right between their legs. But wait, it gets worse. To really emphasize the point, pun intended, weights were often tied to the person's ankles. Gravity did the rest. The longer you sat, the more the beam slowly tore into your flesh, and depending on how generous the executioner was feeling, you might be left there for hours. Now, the Romans didn't invent the wooden horse. It likely came from earlier Middle Eastern torture traditions, But oh, they adopted it with style, because if there was one thing Rome loved, it was punishment with pomp. This wasn't always a death sentence. Sometimes it was used simply as a very persuasive form of public humiliation. Picture it, a square full of people, a merchant caught cheating customers now screaming atop the horse, while children laughed and vendors sold refreshments. It was pain, performance, and a life lesson all in one. Worse still, Roman generals sometimes used it as field discipline. Soldiers who disobeyed could find themselves straddling the horse as a reminder to follow orders, because nothing says morale boost like internal bleeding. And yes, there were occasional modifications. Some horses were metal, some had spikes. One record even mentions a heated version because apparently Rome was receiving feedback and innovating on the fly. The cruelest aspect of the wooden horse was its public nature. Unlike floggings, which ended relatively quickly, or even crucifixion, which occurred outside the city, the horse was displayed in the center of camp or town. Families walked past the condemned, children pointed, stray dogs sniffed around the victim's dangling feet. For soldiers, this humiliation in front of their comrades was often worse than the physical pain. A respected legionnaire could lose all his status in a few hours on the horse. Roman military historians note that even the threat of the horse was enough to keep units disciplined under extreme conditions. In a world without ID cards, background checks, or Google searches, ancient Rome had a simple solution for keeping track of criminals. Just burn it into their face. Yes, we're talking about branding, not the corporate logo kind, but the kind where your actual forehead becomes a crime tag. And if you were a thief, a runaway slave, or a repeat offender, congratulations. You now had a permanent facial feature that screamed, "Don't trust this guy." The brand was typically made with a heated metal rod pressed into the skin, with the gentle mercy of a blacksmith on deadline. Letters like F for fur, thief, or K for calumniator and false accuser would be burned into your forehead or cheek. Think of it as the ancient Roman version of a one-star Yelp review, but on your skull. And this wasn't done in some private back room. Oh no. The branding was public, a spectacle, a lesson. The idea was to humiliate the criminal, and others would think twice. It wasn't just punishment, it was propaganda sizzling directly into flesh. Now imagine living with that brand. Walking through the marketplace, everyone knows. Trying to get a job, good luck. Flirting with someone, forget it. You weren't a person anymore. You were a walking crime scene. Runaway slaves were especially targeted. Many were branded with the letters FUG, short for fugitivus, meaning fugitive. And if they ran again after that, more severe brands or worse. Slaves weren't just property. They were expected to wear their disobedience as a badge. Some resourceful people tried to remove or disguise the brands through cutting, tattooing, or even makeup. But Rome, always prepared, made those acts punishable too. Tampering with your brand was like trying to Photoshop your criminal record. It didn't work. The actual procedure was as brutal as it sounds. Without anesthesia, the red-hot rod was pressed against the skin, often held in place for several seconds to ensure a deep, permanent mark. Victims were restrained by assistants, and often gagged to prevent them from biting their tongues during the agony. For some crimes, the brands were particularly elaborate. Army deserters might receive complex brands detailing their specific unit and crime. Counterfeiters sometimes were branded with replicas of the coins they had forged, a touch of Roman irony. Later, emperors like Constantine tried to soften this, suggesting brands be placed on the hands or legs instead of the face. But even then, the point was the same: permanent shame. In ancient Rome, freedom of speech was conditional. You could praise the emperor, debate philosophy, and recite poetry. Just don't blaspheme. Because if you spoke ill of the gods, insulted the emperor, or whispered the wrong words into the wrong ears, you might find yourself on the receiving end of a punishment that is both literal and horrifying. Tongue removal. Yes, they really did it. The logic was simple. If your words were dangerous, Rome would silence you permanently. The process wasn't exactly subtle. No anesthesia, no sterile tools, just forceps, iron, and pain. A soldier or executioner would grasp your tongue, then cut it out, or in some cases, tear it out completely. It wasn't surgery, it was state-approved censorship, and it wasn't always about religion. Sure, blaspheming against the gods was a quick path to punishment, especially if you mocked Jupiter in public or questioned the sacred fires. But often, blasphemy meant speaking against the emperor or the moral order of the empire. Basically, if your mouth made powerful people uncomfortable, you were suddenly a medical emergency, a wrong joke, a heretical whisper, a rebellious chant. Snip. This punishment wasn't just brutal, it was theatrical. Public tongue removal sent a clear message. Words have power, but ours has more. And even if you survived the grisly experience, life afterward wasn't exactly a picnic. You couldn't speak clearly. You couldn't argue your innocence. You couldn't even scream properly. It was isolation through mutilation, a scarlet letter carved not into your skin, but into your silence. Most disturbing was the surgical precision required. Unlike simple floggings or even crucifixions, removing a tongue without killing the victim required some anatomical knowledge. Cut too deep, and the person would bleed to death. Not deep enough, and the tongue might partially regenerate. Roman executioners apparently acquired specific expertise in this particular skill. The social consequences went beyond the inability to speak. In a culture that highly valued oratory and debate, someone without a tongue was effectively erased from civic life. They couldn't participate in politics, negotiate in the marketplace, or even testify in their own defense at a trial. They became walking ghosts. Ironically, some of the early Christian martyrs suffered this fate. They refused to renounce their faith and continued preaching. Rome couldn't silence their ideas, so it went for the messenger, literally. Of course, Christians later turned these stories into tales of divine valor, which only angered the Romans more. What makes this punishment particularly significant is what it reveals about Roman priorities. For a civilization that prided itself on its legal and cultural sophistication, the use of mutilation as a tool of censorship shows how much they feared the power of dissenting words. In ancient Rome, fashion didn't kill unless you were wearing the tunica molesta, or as we might call it, the flammable death tunic. Imagine this. You're led into an arena or tied to a stake, and instead of chains or ropes, the executioner approaches you with a tunic. Oh, good, you think, at least they're giving me something to wear. Then you notice it's dripping, not with water, but with pitch, tar, and oil. This is the tunica molesta, literally troublesome tunic, but more accurately, highly flammable nightmare onesie. It was a garment soaked in combustible material, fitted snugly, and then ignited while you were very much alive and inside it. This wasn't just an execution method, it was a public performance, most famously used under emperors like Nero, who turned executions into evening entertainment. During his infamous garden parties, Nero used the tunica molesta to illuminate the grounds, human torches lighting his twisted vision of Roman leisure. Who wore it? Arsonists, traitors, Christians, anyone deemed worthy of a particularly theatrical ending. The flames adhered to the body, melting skin, igniting hair, and scorching lungs. And there was no escape, no way to roll and put it out. The tunic stuck to you, it burned with you. And because Rome loved a good mythological reference, they sometimes modeled it after Hercules' poisoned shirt, a garment that caused the hero unbearable agony before his death. Rome didn't just kill you, it made it poetic. The true genius, if we can call it that, was in the psychology. You weren't just dying. You were displayed screaming, thrashing, wrapped in fire while crowds watched. It sent a message clearer than any inscription in stone. This is what happens when you cross the empire. Nero had a particular preference for this form of execution for Christians. According to the Roman historian Tacitus, he used these human torches to illuminate his gardens during nighttime parties, a scene of unimaginable horror mixed with decadent celebration. Guests dined and conversed while human beings slowly burned around them. The public and prolonged nature of this punishment was key to its purpose. Unlike a quick beheading, which ended in seconds, the burning tunic could take up to half an hour to kill its victim. All that time, the condemned remained visible, a living demonstration of Roman power and the consequences of defying its authority. Some records even suggest that music was played during the burning. Nero reportedly played his lyre as the flames rose, a full performance. The most horrific aspect was the specific design of the tunic. It wasn't simply clothing soaked in oil. The adhesive mixture of pitch, resin, and oil created a substance similar to modern napalm, which stuck to the skin and continued burning even as the victim tried to roll or thrash to extinguish the flames. It was torture engineering. When we hear the word crucifixion, most of us immediately think of its most famous victim, Jesus of Nazareth. But this punishment was a Roman standard, perfected over centuries and applied to thousands of unfortunates across the empire. It wasn't just a method of execution, it was a political statement written in blood and suffering. The Romans didn't invent crucifixion. They likely adopted it from the Carthaginians or Persians, but they systematized it with their characteristic efficiency. Crucifixion was reserved primarily for non-citizens, slaves, and enemies of the state. It was considered too degrading for Roman citizens who, if sentenced to death, had the privilege of a quick beheading instead. The physical process was designed to maximize both suffering and public display. It began with flogging, using a flagrum, a whip embedded with pieces of bone and metal. This initial punishment was often severe enough to expose bone and internal organs. Some victims died from this preliminary torture alone. Next came the carrying of the patibulum, the horizontal beam of the cross, to the execution site. Contrary to popular depictions, victims typically carried only this crossbeam, not the entire cross. The vertical posts were often permanently fixed at execution grounds. The condemned, already weakened from flogging, might carry this 75-100-pound beam through public streets, a mobile spectacle of Roman justice. At the execution site, the victim was typically stripped naked, a final humiliation in a society where public nudity was shameful. They were then attached to the cross, usually with nails through the wrists, not the palms, which couldn't support body weight, and feet. Sometimes ropes were used instead, which prolonged the suffering as death took longer to come. The position on the cross was carefully designed for maximum agony. The body was positioned with arms outstretched and knees slightly bent, forcing the victim to push up to breathe. Each breath required pulling up against the nails, scraping wounded flesh against rough wood. Exhaustion would eventually make breathing impossible, leading to asphyxiation. Death was slow, taking anywhere from hours to days, depending on the victim's strength and whether any mercy measures were applied. Sometimes legs were broken to hasten death, as this prevented the victim from pushing up to breathe. Other times, a seat or footrest was added to the cross, not out of compassion, but to prolong suffering by making it easier to breathe longer. The locations chosen for crucifixion were always public and prominent, usually alongside major roadways entering cities. This ensured maximum visibility. Imagine traveling to Rome and seeing dozens of crosses lining the approach, bodies in various stages of death. The message was unmistakable. Defy Rome, and this awaits you. What made crucifixion particularly effective as a deterrent was its combination of physical torture, public humiliation, and symbolic meaning. The victim died slowly, naked, unable to shoo away birds or insects, often covered in their own excrement, in full view of passers-by. There was no dignity, no privacy, no mercy. The psychological component was just as calculated as the physical one. Family and friends of the condemned could watch, but not intervene. They couldn't provide water or hasten death. They couldn't even retrieve the body without permission. Often, the bodies were left on crosses until they rotted or were consumed by scavengers, denying proper burial rites considered essential in Roman religious tradition. From a medical perspective, crucifixion caused a perfect storm of torments. Victims suffered hypovolemic shock from blood loss during flogging, severe dehydration, exhaustion from muscle strain, traumatic fever, and eventually asphyxiation as chest muscles failed. Some victims experienced crushing chest pain as fluid accumulated around the heart. Others developed pulmonary edema, essentially drowning in their own fluids. The Romans kept meticulous records of their crucifixions. During the suppression of Spartacus's slave revolt in 71 BCE, General Crassus crucified 6,000 slaves along the Appian Way from Rome to Capua, one slave every 30-40 meters for 200 kilometers. After the siege of Jerusalem in 70 CE, so many Jews were crucified that, according to Josephus, there was not enough room for the crosses and not enough crosses for the bodies. Different types of crosses were used, each with its own psychological implications. The traditional Latin cross, plus, was common, but the Tau cross, T, and the St. Andrew's cross, X, were also employed. Sometimes victims were crucified on trees or upside down. The method could be tailored to the crime or the whim of the executioner. Despite its ubiquity in the Roman world, crucifixion remained controversial even among Romans themselves. Cicero called it the most cruel and disgusting punishment, and Roman citizens were legally protected from it. This highlights the fundamental purpose of crucifixion. It wasn't just execution, but a statement about human worth. Those on the cross were being explicitly labeled as subhuman. What's particularly chilling is how the practice evolved over time. Early crucifixions were relatively straightforward, but as the centuries passed, Roman executioners became increasingly creative, adding elements like pre-torture, positioning, and even post-mortem mutilation. It became an art form of cruelty. With regional variations across the empire, the practice was finally abolished by Emperor Constantine in 337 CE, after his conversion to Christianity had made the cross a sacred symbol rather than a tool of torture. By then, crucifixion had claimed countless lives across the empire, its victims ranging from anonymous slaves to religious leaders whose deaths would reshape history. When it came to killing creatively, ancient Rome always had something simmering, literally. Enter one of their lesser-known but deeply disturbing punishments, execution by hot ashes. Not as famous as crucifixion or lions, but it might be one of the slowest and most psychologically terrifying ways to die ever devised. No swords, no bloodshed, no quick release, just ashes, heated, suffocating, and endless. This grotesque method is attributed, unsurprisingly, to Emperor Nero, a man who treated executions like performance art. In one recorded case, Nero had an enemy buried up to his neck in a pit. So far, classic Rome, but instead of decapitating or stoning him, Nero added a twist. A funnel was inserted into the man's mouth and hot ashes were slowly poured down. Not boiling water, not fire, ashes. At first glance, it seems harmless. Ashes are soft, right? But here's where the horrific genius enters. Ash is scorching. It clogs the throat, burns the lungs, and suffocates from within. It doesn't kill quickly. It smothers slowly, gradually. You feel every moment, every breath becoming fire, every swallow becoming your last. And as the ash settles, you're not bleeding. You're not burned on the outside, but inside everything is failing. It's death by dust, death by suffocation dressed as silence. Why ashes? Because it was humiliating, undignified. Ashes were the remnants of destruction, used to clean dirt, erase traces of things burned. To die in ashes was symbolic. It meant you were beneath notice, unworthy of steel or flame. You weren't even worth a dramatic death, just the slow grinding of what remained. The psychological aspect of this punishment was perhaps its most twisted feature. The victim remained fully conscious through much of the process, unable to expel the ashes, unable to breathe properly, but fully aware of their impending death. Unlike crucifixion, where you could at least scream your anguish, the ashes silenced your final moments with brutal efficiency. The ashes themselves were often a byproduct of other executions, mixed with temple hearth residue to add an air of divine judgment. You weren't just being eliminated. You were being eliminated with the burned remains of sacrifices and other criminals, a final symbolic indignity. Worth noting, this punishment wasn't common. It was reserved for those Nero really wanted gone. People whose very existence he wanted to quietly erase, but with maximum psychological torment. And to the crowd, it didn't look like much. No blood, no screams, just a man in a hole and a trickle of grey dust. What makes this method especially terrible is its focus on internal contamination. It wasn't a simple execution. It was an inversion of purification. Instead of cleansing with fire, as many ancient cultures did symbolically, they polluted you from the inside out. You became literally a vessel of ashes. Most Roman punishments ended with the body, but some reached further, grasping at memory, legacy, obliteration. This is the damnatio memoriae, the condemnation of memory. Rome's most unsettling punishment, because what's worse than death? Being deliberately forgotten. If you were an emperor who disgraced the state, a general who rebelled, or a senator who fell too far from favor, Rome might not just kill you. They would erase you completely. Statues smashed or defaced, inscriptions chiseled away, paintings painted over, your name struck from official documents, coins, and monuments. If you had achievements, they were reassigned. If you had followers, they were silenced. And the most devastating part, it worked. Many of the people subjected to damnatio memoriae were powerful, known, feared. Yet today, we don't even remember their names because Rome was that good at erasure. Entire reigns fade into silence. It's historical vaporization. One of the most famous examples was Emperor Geta, brother of Caracalla. After Caracalla had him murdered in his own mother's arms, no less, he didn't stop there. He ordered Geta's image removed from every mosaic, painting, and bust. Thousands of inscriptions were edited, his name hand-scraped away. In some surviving artwork, you can still see the ghost of Geta's figure. Awkward spaces, half-faces, partially scraped names. It's eerie, like history caught in the act of forgetting. But damnatio memoriae wasn't just about revenge. It was about control. If Rome could rewrite the past, it could sculpt the future. If you could make it seem like someone never existed, then perhaps their ideas never existed either. It was the empire's way of saying you were never here. And if anyone says otherwise, they're next. The process was meticulous and total. Teams of workers were sent to identify and destroy every mention or image of the condemned person. Coins were recast, inscriptions were recarved. Statues might be toppled in a fit of public rage, but the real work of erasing someone from history was slow, methodical, relentless. It was a centralized effort to create a person-shaped hole in the Roman narrative. For Romans, who deeply believed in the importance of maintaining family name and reputation through generations, being subject to damnatio memoriae was a fate truly worse than death. You didn't just lose your life, you lost your cultural immortality, your place in the great tapestry of Roman history. There's something terribly modern about it too. We talk today of cancel culture, of social erasures, of reputations destroyed in hours, but Rome was doing it 2,000 years ago, just with chisels instead of tweets. The legal mechanism behind damnatio memoriae reveals much about Roman values. While often ordered by emperors, it technically required a decree from the Senate. This gave the erasure official legitimacy and made participation mandatory. Citizens who preserved images or spoke the name of the condemned could themselves face punishment. It wasn't just state censorship. It was enforced collective amnesia. The physical evidence of damnatio memoriae survives despite Rome's best efforts. Archaeologists find statues with replaced heads, inscriptions with obvious gaps where names once were, and family trees with conspicuous absences. Perhaps most telling are the official acts of the Senate, where entire sections have been methodically erased and rewritten to remove references to the condemned. The psychological impact on families was devastating. Not only did they lose a relative to execution, but they were forbidden from mourning publicly or maintaining any memorials. Children might be forced to formally renounce their parent. Names that had been in families for generations suddenly became dangerous to use. The erasure rippled through generations, creating gaps in lineage and identity. Some clever Romans found ways to preserve memory despite the ban. Private diaries kept hidden, coded references in seemingly innocent writings, or small tokens passed through families kept some memory alive. But these were dangerous acts of defiance. The empire's reach was long, and informants were everywhere. The process varied in thoroughness, depending on the condemned's importance and the emperor's determination. A minor senator might merely have his public inscriptions removed, while a truly hated emperor, like Domitian, would have thousands of statues destroyed throughout the empire. Coins bearing his image would be melted down or restruck, and his name would be carefully chiseled from every public monument. Ironically, some of the most completely erased figures are known to us precisely because their erasure was so thorough. The very effort to remove them created a negative space that historians noticed. Emperor Geta, mentioned earlier, is now studied specifically because of how systematically his brother tried to erase him. There were occasionally therapeutic justifications given for damnatio memoriae. Romans believed that bad emperors or traitors might corrupt society even after death if their memory persisted. Erasing them was presented as a form of societal healing, removing a cancer from the body politic. Of course, this conveniently served the political interests of whoever ordered the erasure. Interestingly, the term damnatio memoriae itself is modern. Romans never used this exact phrase, which is a bit of historical irony. We've named their practice of erasure with a name they never used, creating a linguistic ghost, much like the figures they tried to eliminate. So as we close this strange journey through Rome's most bizarre punishments, remember this: the cruelest punishment wasn't fire or lions or ropes. It was the silence that followed. Because in ancient Rome, the worst thing that could happen to you was to be forgotten. Just when you thought Roman punishments couldn't get any stranger, enter their practice of putting animals on trial. Yes, you read that correctly. Rome, that bastion of legal sophistication, occasionally held formal trials for animals accused of crimes, complete with advocates, evidence, and sentencing. This wasn't just some quirky legal footnote. It was a fully developed practice with its own rationale. If an animal killed a human, particularly a Roman citizen, it wasn't simply destroyed as a dangerous beast. It was charged with murder, tried in court, and if found guilty, executed with all the ceremony of a human criminal. The proceedings followed a structure similar to human trials. The animal would be held in the same prison as human defendants. A court date would be set. Evidence would be presented about the animal's behavior and the circumstances of the incident. Sometimes, though rarely, animals were actually acquitted if the court determined they had been provoked or were defending themselves. More commonly, however, guilty verdicts were rendered. The punishment had to fit the crime, of course. A pig that killed a child might be dressed in human clothes and publicly hanged. A dog that bit a magistrate could face crucifixion. Bulls that gored their handlers might be sentenced to death by fire or drowning, particularly symbolic methods meant to purify the community from the taint of unnatural violence. What makes this practice particularly fascinating is the underlying worldview it reveals. Romans believed in a natural order where humans, specifically Roman citizens, stood at the apex. An animal that killed a human wasn't just dangerous, it had violated cosmic hierarchy. The public trial and execution weren't just about removing a threat, but about restoring proper order to the world. The spectacle element cannot be overlooked. A pig execution might draw hundreds of spectators. The animal would be dressed in clothes, sometimes even a wig if it had killed a woman, paraded through the streets, and then executed on a specially constructed platform. Witnesses were required, proclamations were read, and the entire event was recorded in official court documents. Archaeological evidence supports these accounts. Researchers have found remains of animals buried in ways consistent with execution rather than normal butchering or sacrifice. Some show evidence of binding or restraint before death, suggesting ceremonial treatment rather than practical slaughter. While this practice might seem absurd to modern sensibilities, it reflects Rome's deeply held belief that justice wasn't just about punishing wrongdoers, but about maintaining cosmic balance. An unpunished killing, even by an animal, created a stain on the community that required formal cleansing through legal process. The animal trials also served practical purposes. They demonstrated that absolutely no one, not even an uncomprehending beast, was above Roman law. They provided a structured outlet for community outrage following a shocking death, and they reinforced the special status of human life, particularly Roman life, in the natural order. As we reach the end of our journey through Rome's most bizarre punishments, it's worth taking a moment to reflect on what these practices tell us about Roman society itself. Far from being merely sadistic spectacles, these punishments reveal a complex civilization with sophisticated, if disturbing, ideas about justice, symbolism, and social control. The Roman approach to punishment was theatrical by design. Public executions weren't just about eliminating criminals, they were elaborate morality plays where the condemned literally embodied specific transgressions against the state or gods. The methods chosen, whether burial alive for vestals or poenaculi for patricides, created a direct symbolic link between crime and punishment. What's particularly striking is the Romans' attention to detail. These weren't hasty killings, but meticulously planned events with specific props, locations, rituals, and audiences. The wooden horse, the heretic's fork, the tunica molesta, all were designed not just to cause pain, but to communicate complex messages about power, piety, and the consequences of defiance. We might be tempted to view these punishments as evidence of Roman barbarism, but this would be missing the point. Rome was simultaneously building aqueducts, developing sophisticated legal codes, and creating architectural marvels that still stand today. The same minds that designed the Pantheon designed these punishments. This wasn't mindless cruelty, but calculated social engineering. Roman punishment reflected their hierarchical worldview. Your method of execution depended largely on your social status. A senator who committed treason might be allowed the dignity of suicide, while a slave would face crucifixion for the same offense. Punishment wasn't just about the crime, but about reinforcing who you were in the social order. Perhaps most revealing is how punishment changed as Rome itself changed. During the Republic, punishments were relatively restrained. As the empire expanded and internal tensions grew, punishments became increasingly spectacular. By the time of emperors like Nero and Caligula, execution had evolved into a form of mass entertainment, reflecting Rome's growing societal stresses and the increasing centralization of power. The religious dimensions cannot be overlooked. Many punishments contained elements of ritual purification. The condemned didn't just die, they symbolically cleansed the community of pollution through their suffering. This explains why methods like burning, drowning, and burial were so common. All were traditional methods of purification in Mediterranean religious practice. What makes these punishments truly chilling isn't just their physical brutality, but their psychological sophistication. Rome understood that the most effective punishment wasn't just painful but meaningful. It told a story, reinforced values, and lingered in the collective memory long after the condemned had perished. As we drift towards sleep tonight, these ancient practices may seem comfortably distant, but perhaps we should question whether our own society's methods of handling transgressors are truly as far removed from Roman thinking as we'd like to believe. The forms have changed, but the human desire for justice, retribution, and order remains remarkably consistent across the centuries. If you've enjoyed this nighttime journey through the darker aspects of Roman justice, consider sending a super thanks. It helps me create more content like this and is deeply appreciated. If you're new here and enjoyed this historical sleep journey, consider subscribing. I explore different historical periods and experiences every week, all designed to be both educational and relaxing. Let me know in the comments. Which aspect of these Roman punishments surprised you the most? Or if you were transported back to this time, what modern convenience would you miss the most? For those still awake, let me share a final reflection on these Roman punishments. Despite all their brutality and theatricality, these methods tell us much about Roman society itself. A culture obsessed with order, honor, and hierarchy, where punishment wasn't just retribution, but public spectacle, warning, and ritual. Rome's legacy is complex. It gave us laws, architecture, enduring literature, but it also showed us the darkest shadow of institutionalized power. Their punishment methods, so ingeniously cruel, so meticulously designed, remind us that even the most advanced civilizations can harbor terrible brutalities. As you drift towards sleep tonight, remember that we live in comparatively merciful times. Our justice systems, while imperfect, no longer view public suffering as entertainment or torture as necessity. The silence deepens now. The shadows of ancient Rome fade. The distant echo of their punishments dims like the last glow from an oil lamp. Rest easy, knowing that the rigors of Roman justice remain where they belong, in the sleepy pages of history. Good night.